In the shadows of the 18th and 19th centuries, four men walked among us, claiming to hold the keys to immortality and the secrets of the universe. They weren't just visionaries, they were architects of a truth that still echoes today. This is the story of the four minds that enlightened the West.
I mean, what a setup, right?
Right. But seriously, if you've ever wondered where the line between hard science and actual magic sits, you are absolutely in the right place. Welcome to the deep dive.
It's great to be here. We have a seriously fascinating stack of sources to go through today.
Yeah, we've got historical memoirs, these really dense archival texts from the Theosophical Society, some great Google Arts and Culture files, and contemporary accounts of ancient alchemy.
And it is just a remarkable collection of documents because it really forces us to look at an era that feels, completely contradictory.
Oh, totally.
We are essentially dropping into Europe right in the throes of the Enlightenment. So this is the age of reason.
The birth of the modern scientific method, basically.
Exactly. But the archival texts reveal that at the exact same time, the absolute brightest minds were aggressively obsessed with the occult.
Which is just wild to think about.
It is. And today we're tracking the intellectual lineage of four very specific figures: the Countess St. Germaine, Cagliostro, Mesmer, and Dianon Sarasati.
Right. And the text suggests that these men basically operated as emissaries of this ancient hidden knowledge.
Yeah, that's the premise we're looking at.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because on paper, it seems crazy that an era that's defining itself by microscopes and, mathematical proofs would be chasing invisible magic.
Well, human curiosity doesn't just stop at the physical layer of reality.
Right. I mean, the Enlightenment gave us these incredible tools to measure the universe, but a telescope doesn't answer the ultimate existential questions, like why is there something rather than nothing?
Or how do we overcome our own physical decay?
Exactly. And that desire to decode the underlying machinery of existence is just a constant.
Oh, absolutely. We see it today, too.
Oh, yeah. In the pursuit of quantum consciousness or people trying to find a unified field theory?
Precisely. The Enlightenment thinkers were searching for the exact same hidden blueprint. And they really believed they could find it in the ancient philosophy of alchemy.
Which, we should clarify, had evolved a lot by this point.
Right. It had moved way past its Hellenistic roots in Egypt and its time in the Islamic world.
Yeah, by the time someone like Sir Isaac Newton is poring over these texts, they aren't just trying to make physical gold out of lead.
No, not at all. They were looking for the unified theory of matter.
Operating on Hermeticism, right. That ancient framework where matter and spirit are mirrored, as above, so below.
Exactly. And that framework provided the theoretical justification to, attempt transmuting base elements into higher forms.
Okay, so before we get into the four men, we have to look at the archetype they were stepping into, the gold standard of this whole alchemical pursuit.
Right, we have to talk about Nicholas Flamel.
Yes, the historical Flamel, who actually lived in the 14th century.
But the myth surrounding him absolutely exploded in the 17th century.
It really did. So according to the lore, he was this humble scribe who had a highly specific dream.
An angel appears to him, right?
Yeah, an angel presents him with this rare text and promises that one day Flamel would see within those pages what no other man could.
And then incredibly, a stranger literally walks up to Flamel holding that exact physical book from the dream.
The Book of Abraham the Jew? I mean, what are the odds?
Well, that's the magic of the lore. And Flamel supposedly spends years translating it, unlocking that Hermetic framework we just mentioned.
And he ultimately figures out how to create the Philosopher's Stone.
Right, the ultimate alchemical prize.
This theoretical substance that grants unimaginable wealth through elemental transmutation, and of course the elixir of life, which halts cellular aging.
And what's wild is that the historical record does actually show that the real Flamel suddenly became incredibly wealthy and philanthropic.
Which just poured absolute gasoline on the rumors.
It completely did. And this narrative wasn't just tavern gossip either.
No, by the 17th century, the foundational minds of modern physics and chemistry.
People like Newton and Robert Boyle.
Yeah, they were rigorously studying these specific alchemical texts.
They genuinely believed a fundamental mechanical truth of the universe was hidden within these bizarre allegories of dragons and colored vessels.
Okay, hold on. I have to look at this through the lens of a skeptic for a second.
Fair enough.
Isn't the Flamel story basically a centuries-old viral urban legend?
I mean, yeah, you could definitely argue that.
Because we have sources suggesting that 17th century publishers literally invented the Flamel the Alchemist persona just to sell newly printed, quote-unquote, ancient books to a hungry market.
But a very lucrative business model back then.
Right. So if the brightest, educated elite of the Enlightenment were already so primed to believe in immortal, wealthy alchemists, doesn't it seem like the easiest thing in the world for a highly charismatic person to just walk into a Parisian salon, use a little sleight of hand, and play the part?
That cynical view is absolutely justified. It's incredibly easy to assume the public was simply being taken advantage of by educated grifters.
Especially in high society.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But when we critically analyze the contemporary accounts from other scientists, the men who eventually emerged to fill this alchemical archetype were not just cheap tricksters.
They weren't?
No. The sources show they possessed genuine, inexplicable knowledge that entirely baffled the greatest empirical minds of their day.
Wow.
They were demonstrating phenomena that straight up defied the known laws of physics and chemistry at the time.
Okay, so the appetite for tangible proof was massive. And it's into this desperate, magic-hungry elite society that our first major figure arrives.
The Count of Saint Germaine.
Yes.
Yeah.
We pivot from the myth of Flamel to a living, breathing enigma who just, materializes in European records around the 1740s.
And his origins were a carefully maintained black box.
Totally. Was he the illegitimate son of a Transylvanian prince?
A Spanish Jew connected to royalty.
Nobody knows. He never confirmed or denied any of it.
But he navigated the most exclusive courts of Europe with absolute, unquestioned aristocratic assurance.
And he was a staggering polymath. He spoke dozens of languages flawlessly, played the violin at a virtuoso level, composed complex music.
And seemed to possess absolutely unlimited wealth.
Right. But the most jarring detail across all the memoirs is his age.
Ah, yeah.
He appeared to be a 50-year-old man, and he maintained that exact physical appearance for over 7 decades.
Which is just biologically impossible. But even Voltaire, who was arguably the most famous skeptic and satirist in Europe.
Yeah, if Voltaire's vouching for him, we really have to look close.
Exactly. Voltaire famously called Saint Germain a man who knows everything and who never dies.
And the archives suggest he wasn't being entirely sarcastic when he said that.
No, because Saint Germain's reputation survived the skepticism because he consistently demonstrated this impossible mastery over physical matter.
Okay, share the Madame de Genlis anecdote, because this blew my mind.
Right, so we have this incredible account from Madame de Genlis, a prominent writer of the era. She details how Saint Germain painted historical subjects, but he didn't use standard oils.
No, he literally manipulated crushed jewels.
Yes, emeralds, sapphires, rubies, he turned them into his pigments.
Which shouldn't even work as paint.
Exactly. But he somehow altered the refractive properties of the paint so that the jewelry on his canvas shone with an astonishing, blinding brilliance.
And he completely refused to reveal the chemical process behind it.
He kept it a total secret.
I mean, imagine you're a jaded Parisian noble sitting in your salon and someone hands you a canvas that is physically radiating light.
He would be terrifying and mesmerizing.
But his demonstrations went way beyond avant-garde art. The accounts from Franz Graffer in Vienna are essentially science fiction.
Oh, the primordial Earth story.
Yes. Graffer records a private meeting where Saint Germain casually shows a high-ranking cavalier a pinch of what he calls primordial Earth.
And he claims a tiny amount of this specific dust could trigger a chain reaction.
Right, a reaction that would turn the Sahara Desert into a blooming paradise in 3 minutes.
It's just an unbelievable claim. But in that exact same meeting, he pushes the boundary of impossibility even further.
The silver plate.
Yes. He pulls out a thin silver plate, examines it by the light of a candle, and hands it to the cavalier.
And the plate has instantly captured a perfect, exact mirror image of the cavalier's face.
And Saint Germain tells him this artifact simile portrait making will be discovered by a Frenchman in the next century.
He even predicted that Vienna would eventually advance the technology to produce these images in color.
Which is just...
He is outlining the exact chemical mechanism of photography, fixing light on silver halides a full century before Louis Daguerre invents it.
It really is like a historical Forrest Gump scenario.
Seriously. With advanced applied physics, he's casually dropping that he hung out with Richard the Lionheart and then, inventing photography in a candlelit room.
Just another Tuesday for Saint Germain.
But wait, if he actually had access to this level of technology, the crushed jewels in the mirror trick couldn't have been the main event.
No, they were means to an end.
Was this guy just the ultimate Enlightenment era grifter, using parlor tricks to get free dinners with Louis XV?
Not according to the sources. The theosophical texts outline his underlying philosophy. Saint Germaine was testing his audience.
So the trips were a filter.
Exactly. He possessed massive, inexplicable wealth, yet he spent his time researching industrial processes like fabric dyeing.
Right.
He used these spectacles, a big dose of the marvelous depending on who he was talking to. He used the spectacle of physical alchemy to see who was actually capable of spiritual transmutation.
He was weeding out the greedy aristocrats who just wanted a quick buck.
Exactly. He wanted to find the genuine philosophers who wanted to understand the mechanics of reality. He demanded total mastery over the ego before he would share the underlying science.
But, Saint Germain's requirement for absolute moral purity created a massive bottleneck.
It really did.
If this profound knowledge was meant to genuinely enlighten the wider Western world, it needed evangelists willing to get their hands dirty in the public square.
Couldn't just stay hidden in private salons forever.
Oh, right. Enter Cagliostro and Mesmer.
Yeah. According to the sources, Saint Germaine actually supervised a broader movement to inject this esoteric wisdom into Western science.
He was relying on these successors to act as pioneers?
Exactly. So let's look at Count Alessandro di Cagliostro, who was born Giuseppe Balsamo.
He traveled across Europe and founded the Egyptian rite of Freemasonry.
And the term Freemasonry gets thrown around a lot, but this wasn't just like a social club with secret handshakes.
Right. He was operating as an initiated Rosicrucian, which was a secretive order claiming to hold the esoteric wisdom of nature and the universe.
Yes. And what Cagliostro was actually doing inside this Egyptian rite was teaching a highly structured framework for moral and physical regeneration.
It was essentially a rigorous bio-spiritual boot camp.
That's a great way to put it. He claimed that humans could achieve a state of physical longevity and spiritual perfection.
But it required an intense, grueling 40-day retreat.
Right. Isolation, fasting, and specific meditative practices.
He possessed genuine esoteric knowledge of human physiology and psychology, and he was basically trying to formalize it into a system the West could practice.
But his trajectory takes a really dark turn.
Very dark. Unlike Saint Germaine, who remained utterly untouchable, Cagliostro gets dragged into all these political scandals.
And he eventually dies in a Roman prison, locked in a brutal cell by the Inquisition.
It's a tragic end. And his contemporary, Franz Anton Mesmer, suffers a similarly spectacular fall from grace.
Mesmer's approach was entirely different, but equally radical.
Yeah, in 1783, he founded the Order of Universal Harmony in Paris.
And this was centered around his discovery of what he called animal magnetism.
Which is where we get the term mesmerism or, early hypnosis.
Exactly. But the way he applied it was highly, highly theatrical.
Oh, incredibly theatrical. He constructed this massive buquet.
Like a large wooden tub.
Yeah, a tub filled with iron rods and magnetized water. And wealthy Parisians would gather around it, hold hands, and go into violent convulsions.
And they claimed they were being miraculously healed of all their ailments.
If these guys were sent by a highly advanced intellectual brotherhood, why did they rely on such theatrical, cult-like gimmicks, stuff that ultimately got them arrested or discredited?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, It looks like pure theater, but we have to look at the mechanism of what Mesmer was actually doing.
Okay, let's look at it.
The iron rods and the magnetized water weren't doing the healing. Mesmer had accidentally constructed an incredibly powerful sensory device that leveraged social contagion and the placebo effect.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. By creating a highly charged, ritualistic atmosphere, he was bypassing the conscious mind.
So when one person in the circle convulsed, the mirror neurons of the others fired off.
Exactly, creating a domino effect of massive psychosomatic release.
He was weaponizing psychology and the power of the unconscious mind over the physical body.
Yes, but because the scientific vocabulary for psychosomatic healing didn't exist yet, he called it animal magnetism.
And that's what ruined him. The French scientific academies investigated the baquet, concluded that the magnetic fluid didn't physically exist, and completely discredited him as a fraud.
They essentially threw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah.
They missed the profound psychological breakthrough because they were blinded by the spectacle.
Which highlights the ultimate tragedy of both Mesmer and Cagliostro.
Right. The sources suggest they were given genuine fragments of this ancient science.
Real, actionable knowledge about human physiology and psychology.
But Mesmer and Cagliostro were like Scientists trying to demonstrate nuclear energy, and they got so addicted to the bright flash of the explosion.
That they forgot to build the reactor to contain it.
Exactly. The spectacle literally consumed them.
Saint Germaine stayed detached and maintained his moral purity. But Mesmer and Cagliostro let their egos run wild.
They craved the fame, the money, and the adoration of the French court.
They had access to the advanced science, but they lacked the spiritual maturity to handle the public's reaction to it.
Which really forces a massive shift in our narrative.
Right, because if Cagliostro and Mesmer were the flawed, corrupted translators of this knowledge, where was the original source code actually coming from?
And the archival texts point away from the grand European salons directly toward the east.
Which brings us to the fourth mind, Dianon Sarasati.
Yes. And the contrast here is just jarring in the best way possible.
We're totally leaving behind the silk coats, the crushed jewels, and the magnetized tubs.
Right. Saraswati was an initiated yogi from the Himalayan mountains and a profound scholar of ancient Sanskrit texts.
He wasn't interested in performing parlor tricks for the aristocracy.
Not at all. His mission was radical transparency.
He fought fiercely against superstition, ancient marriage, idol worship, and the rigid caste system in India.
While the European occultists were constantly adding veils of mystery and theatricality to protect the knowledge, Saraswati was aggressively tearing those veils down.
He translated the ancient Vedas, arguing that they were not primitive texts about worshiping multiple deities.
He argued they were sophisticated manuals detailing universal, eternal laws of nature.
I mean, his core teachings read less like mysticism and more like theoretical physics.
They really do. He taught that God is fundamentally formless.
Because if a divine presence had a physical boundary, it could not be omnipresent.
Exactly. And he defined AUM as the highest name of the divine, representing the vibration of all absolute existence.
He is essentially describing a unified field of consciousness.
Yes.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. It's like he is the open source developer of spirituality.
Oh, I love that analogy.
Right. While the European guys were hiding their knowledge behind secret ciphers and magic tricks, was Saraswati essentially trying to give the operating system away for free?
That is precisely it. That synthesis is the overarching theme of these four minds. Saraswati represents the pure, unadulterated pursuit of truth.
So the magic that Saint Germaine, Cagliostro, and Mesmer were demonstrating in Europe
The control over physical matter, the deep psychological influence.
was actually just the physics and psychology that Eastern mystics like Saraswati had understood for centuries.
Exactly. So the elaborate rituals in Paris and Vienna were entirely just packaging.
Because the European elite, who were emerging from centuries of dogmatic religious frameworks that violently punished heresy, they needed the shiny wrappers.
They needed the secret handshakes, the Egyptian rites, and the mysterious tubs to safely swallow the exact same truths that Saraswati was openly preaching in the streets.
Wow. So the occultists in the West had to use disguise and symbolism just to survive?
They had to slowly seed these advanced concepts of human potential into a culture that was not yet ready to hear them plainly.
Whereas Saraswati didn't have to navigate the French Inquisition or the skepticism of the Parisian scientific academies.
Right, he was speaking directly to the underlying reality.
Think about how this applies to us today, though. We look back at the 18th century as this bizarre, contradictory era of powdered wigs and magical dust.
But if you step back and look at our current culture,
We are still living in a world oscillating wildly between hard, empirical science and a desperate desire for the mystical.
we really are.
We are absolutely still looking for our own version of the Philosopher's Stone.
The human drive to transcend our limitations remains identical. We just use a different vocabulary now.
Yeah, we call it biohacking. We call it extreme longevity protocols.
Or we look to Silicon Valley startups implanting chips to merge human consciousness with AI.
Exactly. We are funding massive particle colliders to find the God particle.
Oh.
We are still chasing immortality and the hidden blueprint of the universe.
We still want the magic to be real. We just want it peer-reviewed.
That is so well said. We want the magic, but we want it peer-reviewed.
And, the archive suggests that the blueprint might be real, just operating on a timeline we don't fully perceive.
Right. The texts leave us with one final, incredibly haunting detail.
Yes. In Vienna, right before Saint Germaine seemingly vanished from the European public eye, he held a final meeting with his closest disciples.
And he informed them he was retreating to the Himalayas to rest.
But he made a very specific promise.
He told them, precisely in 85 years, People will see me again.
which is a highly specific, measurable timeline for a supposedly immortal being to lay down.
It really is.
And it forces us to ask a profound question. If this cycle of hidden knowledge being actively seeded into human society truly exists,
If there is a lineage of great minds periodically sent to correct our course, tear down our dogmas, and offer us the source code of reality.
who are the quiet emissaries walking among us right now?
Wow. In the shadows of the 18th century, they wore silk, manipulated light, and played the violin to get our attention.
Today, they might be running a laboratory, writing revolutionary code, or quietly teaching in plain sight, entirely unbothered by the spectacle.
We just have to wonder who is holding the keys to the next century.